Hey everybody, Quantum here, and we are finally going to be making content for Shimmering Skies. I was waiting for the full set to be released before I jumped in on this, so if you are interested in seeing some of the insights that we have here, as of July 29th, it's now like 6 p.m., we now have the full set released. I will be reviewing as much as I can with this set, probably looking at like legendaries, what are going to be like the meta relevant cards in my opinion, what are going to be the money cards. For me, if you're like me and you like foils, what are some of the foils that I'm going to be chasing in this set? So all that will be coming. What's ink pairings are going to be good, how it's going to impact the meta, all of those videos will be coming soon, as we are, I guess, less than 2 weeks away now from the hobby store release of Shimmering Skies, right? We're coming to the end of July. But in this video, as per the title and thumbnail, we're going to be taking a look at the starter decks. And this is relevant before you jump off the video, or if you clicked it in the first place, good for you, but this is relevant because Ravensburger has had a really good track record of releasing very meta relevant cards, so they know what's good in these starter decks, and that's very important because it keeps these cards very low in cost, right? I mean, they eventually end up going up from what we've seen, and sometimes not. But if you look back at set 1, right, things like Hades, the Amber Hades, Aladdin, which was relevant in the Ruby Amethyst deck from set 1. Imagine if Aladdin wasn't in a starter deck, how much it would cost. It was literally one of the most powerful cards in that Ruby Amethyst deck. What was the other one? Oh yeah, Grab Your Swords, how could I forget, which is still meta relevant to this day, right? And then you move forward, you have things like the Gaston, which was very powerful, the Queen, which is still seeing a lot of play today, very, very powerful cards. Obviously Merlin Rabbits and Mim Foxes, very, very, very good cards in Amethyst. But imagine if those cards weren't in the starter decks, how much they would be. Because we are seeing those cards go for a pretty penny even today, despite them being starter decks cards, right? And then we move forward and, you have things like Hiram that was in a starter deck. And the list just goes on and on. So there are very good cards in these starter decks. And if you're not planning on buying boxes, or a case or something, getting these starter decks or trading for some of the cards in the starter decks against players who are maybe a little bit more casual, if you're looking for meta relevant cards, could be an option to consider. So let's go ahead and take a look here. I'm not going to spend too much time reviewing everything, if that's what you were wondering. We're just going to get straight on to what's meta relevant. So the cover cards for this Ruby Amethyst is the new Elsa, which is the super rare, and the Wreck-It Ralph. And these are going to be the foils, I believe. So if we take a look at Ralph, which is the first rare, this one says, first of all, it's a 3-cost inkable 1/4. Quest for 1 is a rare. Whenever you ready this character, gain 1 lore for each 1 damage on him. I don't think that's going to be very good or very meta relevant, but we'll wait and see. But again, that's not something I'd really pay attention to. This new common Anna is potentially pretty interesting, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Another one of the rares you get, which is definitely going to be relevant, if not for anything else, budget players, but it might see its way into Ruby Amethyst to a certain degree. It is uninkable, which hurts it. And we're at the stage in the game where every uninkable character needs to have a very definitive purpose in order to be played, or any uninkable card, sorry, not just character, because these uninkable counts are getting potentially very high because there are a lot of very powerful cards, but they are uninkable to balance them out. But a 4-cost uninkable 3/3, so a decent stat line depending on the ability. It has Rush, that's great. When you play this character, she gains evasive until the start of your next turn. That is very good. So she comes in, she can take out an evasive threat like a Diablo that was played on 3 and Quest on 4. You drop this on 4 if you're on the draw, I believe, right? And then you can take out that Diablo right away. This thing will survive and it will have evasive, which means your opponent can't challenge into it on their turn when you pass back, because it's not until the start of your next turn that this has evasive. So this card can potentially go 2 for 1 in the early game, which makes it potentially very strong. It also quests for 2, which could be relevant. If you top deck this or get into a situation with the rush ability isn't very useful, at least it's quest for 2 and it is a 3/3 body, right? It survives things like a Let the Storm Rage On, which is relevant, but it still does get Medusa. But if you're paying 6 to Medusa a target that's 4, that's not necessarily a bad trade for you. So this card is potentially pretty good, and it's nice to see it in the starter deck. We move on here, and the Elsa, in my opinion, is, I'm probably going to eat my words, but I think this is very good. I think this is very, very good. It is a 5-cost inkable card. It has the name Elsa, which could have, it already has some present application, because does that mean we can potentially see the 8-cost Elsa from set 1 that's uninkable be played now? Because you play this on 5, you get the ability off, and then you shift this on 6 with the Elsa next turn and further continue to exert characters? Maybe. It is a 2/5 body, okay, so a decent size toughness, but very, very underwhelming strength. It has Rush, but again, is that really useful if it's only 2 strength? It has Evasive, Okay, so Russian Evasive, very good combination, but it is inkable, right? We haven't really seen this combination with inkability, right? Because Peter Pan Shadow and stuff like that was always on inkable too. But this ability here is what makes this card amazing, in my opinion. When you play this character, you exert chosen opposing character. And I've been saying this for a while. We need ways to force exertion in this game, and purple is the color that does that. That's why I say purple is probably one of the best colors in the game, even though it got really shafted last set, in my opinion, in Ursula's Return, despite getting the cover card and you know, the Ursula. But that Ursula is very good. Anyways, that's too off topic. Why this character and this color is very good is because you have card draw with Amethyst, but now if you have more cards that have the ability to exert, you have more control factor of the game. And being able to come down, exert something, and then rush into it right away is very good. What's interesting is with this card in Ruby Amethyst, if you have cards that potentially boost strength or something, this card could also just be a lot better, right? You think about like Lumiere. That card isn't really played right now. You think about the new item, the Ruby Chromacon, that is able to exert and give 1 strength to a character. You know, I'm sure there's a few other things as well. What you can also, like, you know, maybe set up too is if you're playing this not in Ruby, let's say, and you have a crab on board, and your opponent, let's say, has like a Chernobog or like a Tamatoa would be a perfect example here. The Tamatoa that's quested, and not quested, sorry, they played it, and you know they dimed it for like 5 or 6 or 7, and you're just like, holy crap, I need to out this Tamatoa. I'm not playing Ruby, so I'm not playing like, you know, Maleficent Dragons or you know, Be King Undisputeds and Be Prepared and stuff to wipe out the Tamatoa. I have a crab on board. What I can do is I can play this Elsa, force the exertion of the Tamatoa, and then use my crab to crash into the Tamatoa, deal 3 damage to it, my crab gets banished, I put 3 strength on this Elsa, it now becomes a 5/5 body, and then I challenge into the Tamatoa. So I've exerted the Tamatoa, and I've taken it out. It did cost me a couple of cards, but I outed a big threat that my opponent was basically basing their whole deck around, because that's what Sapphire decks base their decks around, right? It's Tamatoa Dime. And this is a way that you can answer it with crabs, potentially, right? So there's a lot of application with a card like this. Also, being 5 toughness and having evasive is also relevant, because if it does end up surviving its challenge, it's very hard for your opponent to out this card, given the fact that it does have evasive. Obviously, if you exert a character, if you have another bigger character on board already, this Elsa doesn't even have to challenge into that. Just the fact that it is a Pinocchio, you know, that is inkable, it does cost 3 more and 5 instead of 2. But it is potentially relevant. So there's just like a lot of application and potential combinations that you could use with this card. And in my opinion, that's what makes a card viable, is that you're not pigeonholing it into a very specific scenario to make it good, which we'll get into in just a second. It has a lot of versatility. It has a lot of different combinations that you can use it with in order to make it very applicable in a number of scenarios, right? You can use it with crabs that's already on board. You can use it with any other character that's on board. You can use it as a shift target for a future Elsa, right? It comes down as a card that will exert and out an opponent's threat. Very, very relevant in my opinion. So I do think this is going to be a meta relevant card, and I'm very happy that it is the foil super, because I know I will be picking up 4 foil ones of that. Absolutely. Will it be played in the most competitive version of Ruby Amethyst? Hard to say, but I think it definitely has a lot of merits to it, right? Again, these decks are becoming, the top meta relevant decks are becoming very, very thin on their margins as to what they can and can't include in order to combat the meta. Speaking of, you know, pigeonholing yourself into a very specific effect, oh no, not this, not the Earth Giant, sorry, I'm looking for, that's just a common, which I don't think is very good from what I just read there. I'm looking for this, the Olaf Happy Passenger. So this is an example of a card that is potentially very strong, but what holds it back is the fact that it has a condition that needs to be fulfilled in order for you to get good value off of it. These kind of cards, and every color got a card like this in the set, and some may be better than others, but a card like this costing 9, you never want to play this for 7, 8, or 9. It is a 6/6 body, which is very big and very strong, but you want this to be 6 or less. And in order for it to be 6 or less, your opponent has to have an exerted character in play. So again, this could be relevant if you combine it with some of the exerting effects, and this could become better over time, right, that you get in Amethyst already. But currently, if your opponent has a wide board and they've quested or challenged with their board and they still have a number of exerted characters on field, you're already behind, right? You need to play board control. You need to manage the game state a little bit better. A card like this could potentially do that, right? Being a big body that comes down and quests for 3 and it has evasive, making it very hard to out, making it able to out your opponent's threats that are evasive as well, and likely live a number of different challenges being a 6/6 body. The issue comes in where you have this 9-cost inkable card that's in your hand that's a brick, and like I said, you're not going to be playing it until turns 5, 6, 7, 8 when you have enough ink to play it, assuming your opponent fulfills the condition for you, or you can force the condition being fulfilled. So it's a card that is very niche right now, and I'm not a big fan of these cards until you have ways to really proc the ability much easier, and that's why I think cards like that are very limited compared to a card that like Elsa, where in most scenarios, if not all scenarios, it's going to be pretty applicable right away, despite what other combination of cards you have around it. The final card I'll review, I think, from this starter deck is this Anna, and I'm very happy that this is in the starter deck. This could potentially be one of the better rares. It's hard to say because it does cost 7 and it is uninkable. It is a shift 4, which is very nice, but we need to have a number of good Annas in order to play. The other 3-cost Anna that's a common that comes in this starter deck, which also forces an exertion, your opponent gets to choose one of their ready characters and exerts it for that one, is also uninkable. So I don't know if you're really going to occupy that many uninkable slots for this Anna package in Amethyst. Now, of course, there's Annas in other colors. I think Sapphire is the only one that comes to mind. They have that 2-cost Anna that gets an additional lore for if you have another hero in play, which is still pretty good because it's a 1/4 body for 2 that potentially quests for 2. But shifting this onto like the Sapphire Anna could be relevant, but then that means you're playing Amethyst Sapphire. Is that really irrelevant in combination? We'll have to wait and see. But at 7, it's a 4/5 body, which isn't the worst. If you can shift it on 4, it's very, very strong though. And you don't necessarily want to shift this on 4 on curve, which is another issue, because it's like if I'm playing a weak Anna later on in the game, it likely just doesn't even stick around, right? So if you're shifting this on curve and then you get the very powerful, if not one of the most powerful abilities, you play this character, exert all opposing characters. Very, very good. But if you shift this on 4, what are you really forcing the exertion on your opponent's side? It's just a bunch of 1, 2, and 3-cost characters, right? And not even that many of them. So if to shift this later on in the game, to have an applicable Anna target would be kind of hard, but if you do get this ability off when it can matter a lot, it is very, very powerful, obviously, right, to just exert all your opponent's characters. What's also kind of conditional about this, and why it may not see play, but it's still a very powerful ability, is you're really only playing this if you have a game state where you're able to out your opponent's board. Because if you just top deck this and play it and you exert 3 of your opponent's characters, but then you can't do anything about that, it doesn't do anything, right? It's like, okay, pass back to me, I ready my characters back up. You need to have the existing Maui on board, the existing big characters, in order to out your opponent's big threats, right? But this does seem to fit decent into Ruby Amethyst, where you have a number of rush characters that potentially trade 2 for 1. Because that's the whole thing about rush, right? Your opponent usually plays the game based on what they know is potentially coming and or already on board. And rush, while they can try to predict rush, like there's nothing you can really do about a Maui coming down, being a 6/5 body that likely 2 for 1s all the time anyways, right? And if they don't out the Maui right away, now you get to choose your second target as to what you want to out if you force the exertion with something like an Anna. So this does have some application, it does have some weaknesses, but overall I think it's a good card, and I'm happy that it's in the starter deck, because if it does become meta relevant, I think it could be one of the more expensive rares, similar to how we've seen Mim Fox and stuff kind of go up in price over time. I don't think this will be a Mim Fox by any means, don't get me wrong. Mim Fox is an insanely powerful and broken card, but this is a good card that I think is in the deck. There's one more card I think we want to take a look at here, and it's the Sword released. So Ruby Steel has never really been a thing. They've really, I think, tried to push cards to make people consider this ink pairing, and this is another card in that vein. Not necessarily having to go that route, but I think it does work fairly well with something like the Gustav, if you guys remember that card. It's a 3-cost inkable character. That's a 6/6 body. So yeah, it's a 6/6 character for 3. But when it comes into play exerted, and it cannot ready at the start of your turn. It only readies when you banish an opposing character during your turn. But you're not playing it for the ability of being a big body that can do stuff on your opponent's field. On your field, and has this readying limitation. You play it because of something like the Flynn Rider. You play it because of a card like this. If you're able to drop Flynn Rider on 2, the Gustav on 3, or this card on 3 and Gustav on 4, you have a very powerful combination of things going for you. The Flynn Rider is going to get you 3 lore a turn because nothing is coming down before turn 5. That is a 6/6 body. Maui is the first thing that your opponent can drop when they're on the play. If you're facing an opposing Ruby deck, that can really do that. And then this card will allow you to gain 1 lore if your opponent loses 1 lore. So they have to have lore in order for you to gain the lore. But a -1/+1 swing in lore every turn, if your Gustav just sits there as a 6/6 body that's hard for your opponent to out, is extremely strong. Against other steel decks, facing down a 6/6 body can be kind of hard, especially if you're on Ruby and you're outing the cards your opponent is playing. They have to use songs and stuff to out the Gustav, and it's just really, really hard for them to do, right? They can't really, it's going to be hard for them to challenge into it if you're constantly outing their threats with your own removal, right? They're not going to have a character that's going to be able to drop and take out the Gustav because it won't be able to survive long enough to challenge, right? Purple Steel could potentially get around that to a certain degree with rush characters, but it's still going to be a slow burn, and you're going to be throwing a lot of resources into something like that Gustav in order to take it out basically in order to stop the ability of the Flynn Rider and the Sword Release from proccing. So, it's just interesting to see some of these cards released. Obviously, that card can have application in other ink pairings. Obviously, it's in the Amethyst Ruby starter deck, but yeah, an interesting set of rares. You're getting a lot more value in these starter decks now than you did in like the set 1 starter decks when you got like 1 rare or 2 rares and like a super rare. You're getting a number of different rares, all of which could potentially be meta relevant, like 1, 2, 3, 4 rares, it seems. 5 rares, holy, and a super rare. That's kind of crazy. But yeah, I think there's decent meta applications for those, which is very interesting. The Emerald Steel one looks a little less powerful in my opinion because it seems like they're really focusing on the whole Emerald effects proccing if your opposing characters your opponent's characters have damage on them. So when you take a look, for example, like Bonsai here, I think that's how you say the name. When you play this character, you may exert chosen damage character. So again, it goes back to that philosophy of I need a condition to fulfill this ability. Is this worth playing? Probably not. I know this is just a common, but this is kind of the theme of this deck. So it's interesting as a I don't want to say gimmick, but as a build around for this mechanic, because even the super rare, like the cover card of this starter deck is the Scar. Now this is a decently statted card with a good ability, and that's inkable 4 cost, a 4/2 body, which the 4 toughness here doesn't really matter. I guess I shouldn't say that because it does get grab your swords, but the opponent can't like let the Storm Rage on it or like Tinkerbell target it for the 2 damage or anything like that because it has ward. And if it does end up exerting itself, it has 4 strength, so even if it gets traded out, it usually will put a big hurt on whatever's challenging into it, if not take it out as well, right? The only thing that really takes us out as a 2-for-1 is like a Maui, right? But I mean, Maui takes out everything as a 2-for-1 more or less. But like a Mim Fox will trade with it, for example. Most things will trade into it, especially in the earlier parts of the game, if you choose to exert it. But as we've seen with some of these Emerald cards with wards, sometimes they just come down and sit there. But this again is one of those abilities that when you look at something like this compared to Prince John, like Prince John just sits there with ward as a 1/2 body, but at least you have control over when you force your opponent to discard. Of course, if your opponent is in top deck mode, you probably are fine. Like your Prince John doesn't need to proc. You have no cards for your opponent to discard, which means you're not going to be drawing, but your opponent's in top deck mode, so you've already kind of won that battle. Whereas a card like this says, in order for you to proc the ability, whenever one of your characters challenges a damage character, you may draw a card. So your opponent will need to have an exerted card, and you'll need to have a number of characters on board in order for this ability to proc, right? So think about it like, I mean, obviously the hyena concept. Your opponent needs to have, let's say, an exerted Tamatoa or an exerted Chernobog. So a big body, right? A big toughness body character. And you have like 4 hyenas on board. You drop Scar, and then you challenge into the Tamatoa or the Chernobog. Which, by the way, if your opponent is able to quest with a big body like that, you're likely behind to begin with. But the first hyena challenges and doesn't, you don't get to draw because there's no damage on the Tamatoa yet, let's say, or the Chernobog. But then the other 3, as they challenge into it, you get to draw cards off the Scar. So as they're getting banished in the challenge, because the Chernobog will absolutely decimate whatever challenges into it, at least you're replacing those cards with whatever the Scar draws. But again, it's a fairly conditional thing. You need to have characters on board. Your opponent needs to have an exerted character that you can actually throw multiple characters into potentially to draw the cards, or deal damage to it so that you can challenge into it and draw a card. So it's kind of conditional in that sense. And because of that, again, like I explained earlier, I'm not the biggest fan. So that is your super. You do get the Arthur and the Kronk shift targets for the new Arthur Legendary, and the Kronk super rare that's in this deck. We'll take a look at that. And while we're normally taking a look at the rares, I do want to point out that this new Pete card, 3 cost inkable, 3/3 body, is a decent stat line, similar to like the Aladdin from Ursula's Return. But the effect here is, in my opinion, just really, really strong. This is a really good card for purple steel, where you can bounce this back and then use it over and over again. When you play this character, opponents can't play actions until the start of their next turn. This thing checks a lot of potential decks, right? I mean, the main one that comes to mind is Amber Steel Song, like, because songs are still actions, right? You just shut your opponent down from playing any songs, any actions, right? Play this on turn 6 as your opponent goes into turn 7. They can't be prepared. That kind of thing, right? Very, very powerful card. You cycle this with Mim Snake, Mim Fox. Amethyst Steel just got potentially a lot better. This is a card that, it's a floodgate, right? Let's be honest, guys. It's a floodgate. We're starting to see floodgates come into Lorcana, which I'm, hopefully, I know, man, floodgates really, really annoy people, man. I don't know. We'll see where it goes. But if we take a look here at the different rares that we get, is this the rare Shenzi? No, this you get 2 of. So this is this is the rare one here. This character gets +1 strength for each hyena character, so it's a 3/6 body for 5 inkable. Whenever one of your hyena character challenges a damaged character, gain 2 lore. So again, you're trying to fulfill this condition similar to the Scar, right? I mean, if you can get everything on board, and then, I don't know, cast the Tinkerbell, or cast the Grab Your Swords, or cast any kind of damage spell, damage all of your opponent's characters, and then again, they have to be exerted for you to challenge them. Like, it just seems a little too conditional. So again, not something I'm a huge fan of. Interesting as a gimmick deck, but if there's ever a starter deck tournament, it's like, I think whoever gets the Ruby Amethyst deck is clearly way ahead compared to the person who gets the Emerald Steel starter deck. Still some decent options in here, but it's a little underwhelming for the mechanic that they're pushing here, because you need like actual, like, the steel damaging cards in order for you to get the value out of this starter deck, right? So you have to have some of those cards already if you want to go this route. And I'll circle back, because the pinging damage Emerald Steel deck with like Beast Relentless and stuff is a meta strategy. It may not be super top tier, but with some of the support we're getting in this set, maybe it's something that we are able to revisit, and maybe we'll take a look at that in a future video. Anyways, another steel rare that you're getting is a 4-cost uninkable Yzma. Again, immediately what comes to mind is purple steel, because this is a shift target for the big Yzma, but I mean, if this comes down on 4, I think the shift cost is 4 anyways, instead of just paying the extra 2 and playing it on 6. Regardless though, it is a 1/4 body, quest for 2, rare. During your turn, whenever one of your characters banishes a character in a challenge, you may deal 1 damage to chosen character. Seems very underwhelming to me, but we'll see. I just think, again, so many conditions need to be met just to deal 1 damage. Doesn't really seem all that great. What else did you get? 1 of this, Ed? Is this a rare? No, it's just an uncommon. Quest for 3 though, for 4 uninkable. That's interesting. What else are we getting in here that is a rare? These are not rares. You got the Yzma. We got the Shenzi. Well, we got the Robin Hood. We'll come back to the Kronk in a second. So this one, similar to the Olaf in the Ruby Amethyst deck, a 9-cost 6/6 that reduces by 1 cost to play this character for each 1 damage on opposing character. So this one is actually interesting, because it does not say for each damaged character. It says for each 1 damage on opposing characters. So if there's a character with like 4 damage on it, this card instantly costs 4 less. Am I understanding that correctly? If the opponent has like 4 characters on board, and you like grab your swords, and you deal 2 damage to each of those 4 characters, and they all live, that's 8 damage across 4 characters. This card now costs 1 to play. That seems pretty nice, right? And that's, I mean, again, a fairly, I don't want to say a limiting condition, but a more manageable condition than some of the other things. Because you don't necessarily need your opponent to have a ton of characters on board in order for you to proc this ability. Like, they can just have 1 big character. And if you're able to put a bunch of damage on it, like imagine, again, your opponent has an exerted Chernobog or an exerted Tamatoa, and you just throw a bunch of things into it or damage spells into it and put like 5, 6, 7 damage onto it. Now this Robin Hood comes down for like 3 or 4 or whatever, right? And it's a 6/6 body with ward, which means it can't be targeted by anything, which is nice. And then it quests for 4. What's going to really target this at a 6/6? I don't know, like a World's Greatest Criminal Minds, a Maleficent Dragon, a Dragonfire. Nobody really plays that, but it's not going to get Medusa'd. I guess the benefits is also like if it's exerted, it can't get like Queen, reduced strength, right? Because reducing this by 4, making it a 2/6, it can now be like Sisu'd, like the 8-drop Sisu. So if your opponent already has a Queen on board, they can like drop Sisu after, right? That's potentially something to consider. So a decent, you know, your opponent has to answer this, right? Like, I mean, 4 quests, that's pretty insane. When you look at something like the Chapter 1 Legendary Mickey, Brave Little Tailor, it was an 8-cost inkable, right, for 5/5 with evasive. This is a 9-cost 6/6. Quest for 4. They both quest for 4, but instead of evasive, this has ward and it has this additional ability. So this is one of the ones that I think might be potentially a little bit better. But again, in an Emerald deck, you're never getting to 9 ink usually, right? So it's like you definitely need to fulfill this condition. And if you draw this early, it's like it's just a brick in your hand for the most part, right? Like, again, this is a card that you technically want to play for like 4, 5, or 6. You never want to cast this for 6, 7, well, 7, 8, 9. Even 6 is pushing it, but this is one of the more interesting ones for sure. Yeah, we got a new shift Robin Hood for 5 that shifts for 3, also with 3, well, a 3/5 body. The steel one being legendary is a 3/6. But yeah, could you imagine if they didn't errata Bucky? You would have 8 Robin Hood 5-cost Floodborn that you could play that can all shift on the 1-cost Robin Hood and also shift on the new Robin Hood, which is rather interesting. I don't think this card is good on curve, but I think it's good later on in the game, which is weird because it's a 2-cost card. But when you think about like Merlin Goat coming down and gaining lore, this character says when you play this character, if an opponent has a damaged character in play, you gain 1 lore. We all know how like explosive those like come into play, gain a lore effects are, right? People were complaining about Goat ever since day 1 in Rise of the Floodborn when it came out. This card could potentially be pretty decent, right? It is a 2-cost inkable 2/2 body, so it's a little underwhelming stats for a 2-cost card. Quest for 1 though, but again, being a Robin Hood name, it has that synergy for being a shift target for relevant Robin Hoods. I didn't even read the ability on the 5-cost one. I've read it before, I just don't remember what it does. Let's go back here. Shift 3, this character gets +1 lore for each opposing damaged character in play. Okay, so that's interesting. So yeah, this thing potentially quests for like 2, 3, 4. I don't think this really sees play unless you're building a deck around this, really. Amazing artwork though. Nicholas Cole, another Nicholas Cole card, man. This guy is just fire with the art. Holy, solid art. I love Robin Hood. It's one of my favorite Disney movies, by the way. I think I mentioned that before. We're wrapping up this video soon, guys, so if you're still with me, thank you. This Tug of War card is very interesting, and one of the cards that I think, similar to what Grab Your Swords did, or has been doing ever since set 1, this card is very interesting. It is an action, so it's not a song. It is inkable, though, like unlike Grab Your Swords. But this effect is fairly interesting, especially for the strategy. And when you think about like what Beast Relentless did, or does, this card, you know, procs the Beast Relentless. It procs a lot of the abilities that you would get in this deck. And if you're going to play this Emerald Steel damage strategy, I think you definitely want multiple copies of this. So this is one of those rares that is good that it's accessible in a starter deck, because it could potentially become an expensive rare if this pinging damage thing ever becomes somewhat meta relevant, or even like it's like a casual deck that people want to play. This is a card that I think they need multiples of. Because, again, it's inkable at worst, but choose 1, deal 1 damage to each opposing character without evasive. Can you just imagine, like, you shift the Robin Hood, and then the next turn, if they don't deal with the Robin Hood, you play this and damage, like, 4 characters, and then the Robin Hood quests for 5, right? That we just looked at, for example. So, again, these are just, like, top of the head, day 1 stuff. We'll obviously analyze this stuff a little bit more in future videos, but, yeah, and then the ability to deal 3 damage to each opposing character with evasive is absolutely massive. Most evasive characters are pretty weak, but let's say the opponent plays that new Elsa, which is a 2/5 with evasive. they throw it into something that deals 1 damage to it. If you can deal 3 damage to that, or just deal 3 damage to it and out it, like that's still pretty good value. So an interesting rare, I think, is definitely worth taking a look at. And then the final card I think we're gonna finally look. Oh, actually, sorry, 2 more. I do want to take a look at this uncommon because a 6 cost shift 4 Simba. I don't think the shift 4 is going to be too relevant right now, but having the name Simba, right, we know that already this can shift on the 1-drop Simba in Steel, the 2-drop Simba in Amber. I don't know if there's going to be future targets for this, or, I don't think any of the other existing targets are very good. But it's a 3/5 body, so that's kind of an underwhelming stat line. I know Snow White is also that stat line, one of the reasons that she doesn't really see play. Because it gets Medusa, it gets Zeus, it's just susceptible to everything. But the reason you play this, and I think this is a card for Sapphire Steel, it is a 6-cost inkable, so good, that is inkable. Similar to what Beast Hard-Headed does, but this card says when you play this character, you may banish chosen item or location. So for 1 more ink compared to Beast Hard-Headed, you get a 1 reduction in strength and an additional toughness, which, you can argue isn't the greatest because this makes it a Medusa target. But you don't really care if this gets Medusa for the most part because you get the ability on play. Like when you play it, you just banish the location or item. And why this is so relevant is because we know for a fact that Sapphire Steel suffers with locations, particularly the Queen's Castle. It was one of the reasons that really held that deck back in set 4, in my opinion. It was in theory, Sapphire Steel should be a deck that beats everything if it gets its proper lines of play. But you also have to worry about there are certain interactions that deck really struggles with, and one of them was definitely locations. I remember playing against my friend who was playing Ruby Sapphire, and he teched in McDuck Manors, and I was in control of a game, and he just starts dropping McDuck Manors, and I'm just like, bro, I can't deal with that. And he ended up winning the game. He went from 9 lore to 20 just because I couldn't deal with his McDuck Manors. I constantly kept trying to out his characters and stuff, and it was just once he was able to do 2 interactions in a game and drop a McDuck Manor with a character in a turn, I was just yeah, I'm cooked. I just don't have enough to deal with that. This Simba could potentially solve a problem because it's a body that outs an opposing card on the opponent's side. We've talked about in previous videos how impactful Benja has been, and it's one of the reasons why Spellbook has kind of phased out, is because if a Beast Hard-Headed or a Benja or something comes down and outs a Spellbook, you just lost on curve, most likely, somewhere near your curve. You may play Spellbook on turn 4 or something. Paying 3 ink to just get your card outed and your opponent ends with a 2-questing 2/3 body and a Benja on board. That's a game losing play for you if you get your Spellbook outed by a Benja. The Simba here is also potentially a tempo swing in the Sapphire Steel deck, as well as other Steel decks that might be applicable. But I'm just saying Sapphire Steel because it can ramp to 6 pretty quickly. And just out of Queen's Castle, out any other items. Does this displace Beast Hard-Headed? I think it does, despite it not having the 4 strength. Being the extra cost too, I think is warranted. You'd want to play this over Beast Hard-Headed for the versatility of it being able to banish a location. So despite only being an uncommon, very nice that it's in the starter deck, because again, it's one of those cards that becomes a lot more accessible for people who aren't opening cases and boxes, right? You can get a starter deck or see somebody with a starter deck and trade into this card if you're playing Steel. It makes uncommons more accessible, which is what you want. And the final card I want to take a look at is Kronk, Head of Security. Kronk is by far one of my most favorite characters, if not my most favorite character in all of Disney. Just such an amazingly crafted character, and of course Emperor's New Groove is one of the best movies Disney has ever released. But onto the actual card, a 7-cost uninkable, right off the bat just seems not great, but it is a 6/6 body, which is extremely powerful, and it does have the ability to shift for 5, and we just saw earlier on that there is a decent 2-cost shift target that is actually playable, but more so than just threatening the shift, as with most the Steel Floodborns that have come out have done, things like Tinkerbell, Giant Fairy. Your opponent sees a small Tinkerbell, they're like, do I really want to potentially play into the shift Tinkerbell? I lose my whole board maybe, or the Cinderella Stout-Hearted. The Kronk can be good as a standalone, I just play this character because the 6/6 body is extremely hard to out, right? It doesn't get Zeused away right away. It doesn't get Madame Medusa or anything. But you ideally do want to play this on shift. And of course, you need a hand with it because its ability allows you to, whenever you banish a character during your turn, in a challenge, obviously, you may play a character with cost 5 or less for free. And this is insanely powerful. One of the most powerful interactions I can think of right off the bat with this card is something like Amber Steel. It doesn't have to be Amber Steel Song, just a different variation of Amber Steel where maybe, you shift this and you're able to take out a threat right away. Maybe you take 3 or 4 points of damage on the Kronk, But then your character that you play for free is something like a Rapunzel. It only costs 4, but it comes down, it heals up your Kronk for 3, and then you draw 3 cards. Now you have a 2-questing Rapunzel on board that netted you a +3 on the draw, and then you healed up your Kronk, making it unlikely to be taken out in the next turn. To me, that seems like a massive tempo swing play that could get you back into a game or potentially win you a game right on the spot. Whenever Rapunzel resolves to draw 3, you're usually going to be winning that game. Usually. It's very hard for you to lose. Just some other cards though, just loading up the app and searching for like 4 or 5 cost characters that you can use. From Chapter 1, the Hades that allows you to revive a character from the Banished. Even something like Maximus coming down as a bodyguard to protect the Kronk even, and other characters on board. Obviously, we just talked about Rapunzel. Nothing really from the Amethyst side, nothing really from the Emerald side. Maybe if you want to go back to playing set 1 Cusco. Of course, you could always drop a Maui to just instantly take out another threat as well, which is big. You can drop something like an Aurora to just give your stuff ward, right? Maybe in Sapphire Steel, Aurora could be played again. Nothing really on the Steel side from Chapter 1. But in Chapter 2, you can drop a Mufasa or a Queen. That's always really powerful. The Fairy Godmother, Merlin Rabbit, Merlin Goat, also very, very powerful on the Amethyst side. In Emerald, you can drop something like the Bell Hidden Archer just to play it for free, or even more powerful, dropping something like a Lucifer for free, forcing your opponent to potentially discard 2 cards. That's insane. You out a threat on the opponent's board, then you force them to discard 2 off of a Lucifer being played. That's really strong as well. I'm just going to skip ahead. I'm not going to go over everything. Obviously, you can play like things like Hiram and Cogsworth off of it as well. Beast, Tragic Hero, Kida from set 3. Nothing really from Amethyst or Emerald. You could play a Prince Eric, which is another uninkable in the Ruby side if you're ever thinking of pairing Steel with Ruby. Nothing really on Sapphire there. Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood from set 3 is also something you can drop down here, which is also pretty powerful. And then into set 4, and I know we haven't even looked at the set 5 stuff yet that you could drop, but you can drop a Singer Ariel, the 4 cost, that is a Singer 7, which could be pretty powerful, or the Cinderella Singer 9 even, a Daisy Duck to force a discard, the Brunos or the Isabella in Amethyst in order to just put additional questing power on board, or evasive threats I should say, the Pegasus as well, the Muses, like there's just the Crikey, well probably not Crikey because it would boost up your fuel even further, the Super Goof for more challenging, the Hercules, Daring Demigod for more challenging. Yeah, there's just a lot of targets, and again, as we get more and more 5 and lower cost characters, a card like this just gets more and more versatility, right? So yeah, there's just a few that really can benefit off of this interaction. I do think that if you were going to play this, Sapphire Steel is immediately what comes to mind, but Amethyst Steel is also a great choice. So overall, again, very happy that this is a foil super rare in the starter deck. And I do think that these starter decks are probably the best starter decks we've seen to date. They're very powerful in combinations, obviously. I do think the Emerald Steel one is a little bit more of a gimmick, but if you're ever in a starter deck tournament, if they let you choose which starter deck you're going to play, I would definitely be picking the Ruby Amethyst. Because while the Emerald Steel does have some very powerful cards like that Kronk Shift, it's only a 1-of, right? Whereas this deck, it has a lot more powerful 1-ofs, I think, that can do some more damage, and it's probably just more well-rounded, but yeah, that is my review of the starter decks, guys. I think these are very good for the accessibility of the game, especially for people, like I said, who don't buy boxes or cases. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, though, if you made it this far. Thank you again for watching. Quantum is out.